A team of geneticists at the University of Toronto just finished the most comprehensive DNA study ever conducted on Canadian ancestry. They compared genetic markers from every major population group on Earth with samples from tens of thousands of Canadians. What they found contradicted everything we thought we knew about genetic diversity, migration patterns, and what it actually means to be Canadian. The results were so unexpected that 3 separate labs had to verify the data before publication. According to this research, Canadian DNA tells a story that rewrites our understanding of human migration, challenges long-held assumptions about racial categories, and reveals something extraordinary about how populations blend over time. However, what makes this study truly groundbreaking is not just the science. It is what the findings reveal about identity, belonging, and the biological reality of a country built on immigration. If you are fascinated by the hidden stories in our DNA and what science reveals about human diversity, hit subscribe. I break down groundbreaking genetic research every week that changes how we understand ourselves. Now let's dive into what these scientists actually discovered. For decades, Canada has been called a cultural mosaic, a nation of immigrants, a place where people from every corner of the planet somehow coexist in relative harmony. These were not just marketing slogans, they were demographic facts. By 2020, over 22% of Canada's population was foreign-born, the highest proportion among G7 nations. But here's what nobody had actually studied at scale. What happens genetically when you take populations from 6 continents, put them in the same geographic space, and let 3 or 4 generations pass? Does genetic diversity increase or decrease? Do populations remain distinct, or do they blend in ways we can measure? The answers to these questions had massive implications. For understanding disease susceptibility, for personalized medicine, for tracing migration routes that historical records missed, and for understanding how quickly human populations actually integrate at the biological level. Dr. Sarah Chen, a population geneticist at the University of Toronto, realized nobody had the data. Genetic studies typically focused on single ancestry groups: Europeans, East Asians, Sub-Saharan Africans, and Indigenous peoples. Each group was studied separately, compared against itself or against one control group. Nobody had compared all groups simultaneously against a truly multi-ancestral population. That is when she proposed something ambitious. Take DNA samples from Canadians representing every major ancestry group, then compare those samples against reference populations from around the world. Not just to confirm ancestry, but to measure something more complex. How mixed are Canadians really? And does that mixing create something genetically unique? The project took 6 years to design and execute. They needed 50,000 participants. They established strict protocols to ensure informed consent and privacy protection. They built partnerships with Indigenous communities who had every right to be skeptical of genetic research given the ugly history of science being used to justify colonialism and oppression. But Dr. Chen's team did something different. They brought Indigenous geneticists into leadership roles. They made sure participants owned their data. They committed to sharing findings with communities first before publication. And slowly, trust was built. By 2019, they had their 50,000 samples. Canadians who self-identified as having ancestry from Europe, East Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America, and Indigenous peoples from across the Northern Territories. It was a genetic snapshot of a country in flux. The initial findings came back in early 2020. Immediately, something looked wrong. The reference populations made sense. Genetic clusters from Nigeria showed expected West African markers. Samples from Japan showed East Asian patterns. British samples clustered with other Northern Europeans. Everything aligned with decades of previous research. but the Canadian samples were scattered across the map in ways that did not match self-reported ancestry. A participant who identified as Chinese-Canadian, third generation, showed genetic markers suggesting not just East Asian ancestry, but European and indigenous admixture that should not have been there based on family history. Another participant who identified as Scottish-Canadian had South Asian genetic signatures that predated their known family tree by at least 2 generations. At first, Dr. Chen thought the data was contaminated, lab error, mislabeled samples, the kind of mistake that ruins careers. But after rerunning everything twice with independent verification, the results held. Canadians were not just diverse, they were mixed. Far more mixed than they realized. And this mixing had happened faster and more comprehensively than any population genetics model predicted. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Genetic admixture usually takes centuries to show up at measurable levels across a population. Yet here were patterns emerging in just 3 to 4 generations. Something about the Canadian environment, whether cultural or demographic, was accelerating genetic integration at a rate nobody had documented before. Dr. Chen realized they weren't just looking at ancestry data anymore. They were looking at real-time human evolution. The formation of what could, in a few more generations, become a genetically distinct population. But publishing this came with risks. Genetic research on race and ethnicity is a minefield. Scientists have spent decades trying to undo the damage caused by eugenics, racial pseudoscience, and research that treated human populations like dog breeds. The consensus in modern genetics is clear. Race is not a biological category. It is a social construct. Genetic variation within so-called racial groups is often greater than variation between them. Dr. Chen's findings didn't contradict this, but they could be misused. A study showing that Canadians are genetically blending could be weaponized by people with agendas. Nationalists might claim it proves multiculturalism works. Xenophobes might claim it proves the opposite. Both would be wrong, but that would not stop them. Some of her colleagues urged caution. Sit on the data, they said. Don't publish until you can control the narrative. One senior researcher warned her directly that genetic studies on national populations always get twisted, and that you cannot predict how this will be used once it is out there. She also faced pushback from within indigenous research communities. Understandably. Genetics had been used to delegitimize indigenous identity, to impose blood quantum rules, to decide who counted as real native people based on DNA percentages. The last thing these communities needed was another study treating genetic data like it defined belonging. Dr. Chen spent months in consultation, listening, revising, making sure the research did not replicate colonial patterns. And what emerged was a commitment. This study would not define identity. It would not rank populations. It would not make claims about intelligence, behavior, or superiority. It would simply document what was happening genetically in one specific country at one specific moment in time. In March 2021, the study was published in Nature Genetics, and within 72 hours, it went viral. Not because of the science, but because of one specific finding that caught everyone off guard. When the team compared Canadian genetic diversity to reference populations worldwide, they found something unprecedented. The average Canadian carried genetic markers from at least 3 distinct continental ancestry groups, not 2, 3. In many cases, participants showed admixture from 4 or 5 groups, even when they identified themselves as belonging to just one ethnicity. The most striking example was Canadians who identified as white or of European ancestry. Across the board, these participants showed higher rates of Indigenous and non-European admixture than they reported in family histories, not small amounts. Measurable percentages suggested intermarriage and mixing going back several generations, often unknown to the participants themselves. This was not a fluke. The pattern held across regions. In Quebec, people who identify as French Canadian showed indigenous genetic markers at rates far exceeding oral histories. In the prairies, participants with British or Ukrainian ancestry showed unexpected East Asian and indigenous admixture. On the West Coast, the mixing was even more pronounced, with some participants showing genetic contributions from 6 or 7 distinct populations. But here's where it got controversial. The study also found that Canadians of non-European ancestry showed less admixture on average. South Asian Canadians, for example, had more genetically homogeneous profiles. The same was true for East Asian Canadians and Middle Eastern Canadians. The mixing was happening, but at slower rates compared to European-descended populations. Why? The study did not speculate, but sociologists and historians offered theories. Structural racism, immigration patterns that created ethnic enclaves, intermarriage norms that varied by culture, economic factors that limited geographic mobility for newer immigrant groups, 1,000 invisible forces shaping who partnered with whom. The media, predictably, got it wrong. Headlines screamed, "Canadians are the most mixed people on Earth," and DNA study proves multiculturalism works. Both were misrepresentations. The study never made global comparisons. It never claimed mixing was good or bad. It simply documented what was happening in one country. But the damage was done. The findings were now political. Not everyone was thrilled with the attention. Nationalist groups in Canada seized on the findings to argue that real Canadians did not exist anymore. They said that immigration had diluted some imagined genetic purity. Never mind that the study showed no such thing. Never mind that the very concept of genetic purity is pseudoscience. The data was now a weapon. On the other side, multiculturalism advocates celebrated the study as proof that diversity made Canada stronger. Again, a misreading. The study measured genetics, not social cohesion, economic outcomes, or happiness. Genetic diversity tells you nothing about whether a society functions well. Dr. Chen found herself in the uncomfortable position of correcting both sides. In interviews, she repeated the same points over and over. Genetics does not define identity. Mixing is not inherently good or bad. The study simply shows what is, not what should be. She also had unexpected allies. Indigenous geneticists who worked on the study spoke out. They emphasized that the findings did not threaten Indigenous identity. If anything, they validated what many Indigenous communities already knew, that their ancestors had mixed with European settlers in ways colonial records tried to erase. That blood quantum rules imposed by governments were arbitrary and harmful. That identity is about culture, language, and belonging, not DNA percentages. One Métis researcher involved in the study put the point plainly. They said they had always known they were mixed. That is literally what Métis means. The study does not tell them who they are. It tells settler Canadians that they are more like Métis than they thought. That comment went viral, and it reframed the conversation. Because the real revelation was not that Canadians were mixed. It was that so many Canadians did not know they were mixed. That family histories, whether intentionally or through ignorance, had erased Indigenous and non-European ancestors. That whiteness, as a category, had been protected through selective forgetting. But the study revealed something even deeper. Something that made Dr. Chen's team go back and reanalyze the data 3 more times. The genetic mixing was not random. It followed patterns. Specific patterns suggested historical events nobody had connected to genetics before. For example, French-Canadian participants from Quebec showed Indigenous admixture concentrated in maternal lineages. Indigenous women had partnered with French men during colonization, and those unions had been systematically excluded from official genealogies. Church records, census data, and family trees had all erased these women, but their DNA remained. In the prairies, Ukrainian-Canadian participants showed East Asian genetic markers that dated to the early 1900s. At first, this seemed impossible, but historians confirmed it. Chinese laborers who built the railroads had settled in prairie towns. Intermarriage happened. Then exclusion laws in the 1920s made it dangerous to claim Asian ancestry. Families buried the truth. But genetics remembered. On the West Coast, Japanese-Canadian participants showed unexpected European admixture that predated World War II, before internment camps, before families were torn apart and scattered. This mixing represented partnerships that official histories ignored because they did not fit the narrative of separate, distinct communities. The data was becoming a historical record, a genetic archive of unions, migrations, and human connections that written records had missed or deliberately erased. Every genetic marker was a story. Every admixture percentage was someone's ancestor whose existence had been forgotten or denied. Dr. Chen's team realized they were not just studying genetics anymore. They were doing archaeology. They were uncovering hidden history written in the bodies of living Canadians. Then came the backlash. In late 2021, a conservative think tank published a response paper. They claimed the study promoted replacement theory, the racist conspiracy that immigration was designed to eliminate white populations. The paper was junk science, cherry-picking data and distorting findings. It got media coverage, and it put Dr. Chen in the crosshairs. She received threats. Emails accused her of being part of a globalist plot to destroy Western civilization. Letters claimed she was erasing white identity. Online harassment was so severe the university assigned security to her. At the same time, some progressive activists criticized her from the other direction. They argued that any genetic research on race and ethnicity was inherently harmful. They said it reinforced racial categories even when trying to disprove them. They warned the study gave ammunition to people who wanted to quantify belonging and exclude others. Dr. Chen was stuck in the middle, attacked by racists who hated her findings, and by anti-racists who thought the research should not exist. The pressure was unbearable. She considered pulling the study, requesting a retraction, walking away from genetics entirely. This was not what she signed up for. She wanted to understand human diversity, to contribute to medical knowledge, to help people trace their roots, not to become a lightning rod for culture wars. But then something unexpected happened. Participants in the study began speaking out, Canadians who had discovered surprising ancestry through the research. Their stories changed the conversation. A woman in Ontario learned she had West African ancestry, 3%. Small, but there. Her family had no record of it. She was white-presenting, raised in a white family with a white identity. The discovery sent her on a journey: genealogy research, DNA testing of relatives, and conversations with older family members. She eventually found the answer. Her great-great-great-grandmother had been a black woman from Nova Scotia. She'd married a white man and moved to Ontario in the 1870s. Their children were light-skinned enough to pass as white, and they did for generations. The family erased her, changed the story, hid photographs, and eventually everyone forgot. But genetics remembered. Now this woman had a choice. She could ignore it and pretend the DNA test was wrong, or she could reclaim that ancestor, honor her, and learn her story. She chose the latter and wrote about it. Her essay went viral, not because it was political, but because it was human. It was about family secrets, identity, and the complexity of inheritance. It was about discovering that your history is bigger and messier than you were told. Another participant, a man in Vancouver who identified as Chinese Canadian, discovered he had Indigenous ancestry, 4%. He'd grown up disconnected from Indigenous culture, raised in a Chinese immigrant household, and speaking Cantonese at home. The genetic finding felt like a door opening. not to claim an identity that was not his, but to understand his own history more completely. He reached out to indigenous genealogists and learned that his great-great-grandfather, a Chinese railway worker, had married a Coast Salish woman in the 1880s. Their children faced discrimination from both communities. Chinese settlers did not accept the mixed children, and indigenous communities were wary, so the family assimilated into the growing Chinese community and buried the indigenous connection. But now, over a century later, their descendant knew, and he wanted to honor both parts of his heritage. These stories multiplied, Canadians discovering unexpected ancestry, not as trivia, but as invitations to understand themselves and their country differently. To see that the neat categories we use, white, Asian, indigenous, and black, never captured the full reality. People have always crossed boundaries, formed partnerships, and created families that defied easy labels. And slowly, the narrative shifted. The study was not about proving multiculturalism or denying identity. It was about revealing complexity. It showed that human history is a story of mixing, movement, and survival. Borders and categories are recent inventions. Underneath them, we are all descendants of people who migrated, adapted, and blended. By 2022, the controversy had mostly faded. The study had done its work. It existed now as a reference point, a data set that other researchers could build on. But Dr. Chen was not done. She had seen how the findings could be misused, and she had also seen how they could be empowering. So she started a follow-up project, this time focused on genetic health. Because here is what the original study also revealed. Genetic diversity, the kind Canadians had in abundance, came with medical advantages. Populations with high admixture showed lower rates of certain genetic diseases. Conditions like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell anemia, and Tay-Sachs, which are more common in genetically homogeneous populations, appeared less frequently in highly mixed Canadian populations. This was not about racial hierarchies. It was basic genetics. When populations mix, harmful recessive genes become less likely to pair up and cause disease. Genetic diversity, in this narrow medical context, was protective. Dr. Chen's new project aimed to use this knowledge to improve healthcare, to create better screening tools, to understand why certain medications worked differently in mixed populations, to build precision medicine that accounted for genetic complexity instead of assuming everyone fit into neat racial boxes. This research was quieter, less controversial, but arguably more important. It took the insights from the ancestry study and turned them into something practical, something that could save lives. In 2024, the first results from the Health Genetics Project were published, and they confirmed what Dr. Chen suspected. Canadians, because of their high genetic diversity, were at lower risk for dozens of genetic conditions compared to reference populations. But they were also at higher risk for others, particularly conditions that emerged from specific gene combinations only possible in highly mixed populations. This had huge implications. It meant Canadian healthcare needed different screening protocols, different risk assessments, different approaches to genetic counseling. You could not just import guidelines from the United States or Europe and assume they would work. Canadian genetics were different enough to matter. The findings also revealed something poignant. The genetic mixing that some people feared, that nationalists called erosion or replacement, was actually making the population healthier. It was not because mixing itself was magical, but because genetic diversity created resilience. It reduced the odds of inheriting 2 copies of harmful mutations. It increased the range of immune responses. It made populations more adaptable. Evolution had always worked this way. Mixing was the engine of adaptation. It is the reason humans survived ice ages, plagues, and migrations across across hostile terrain. Isolated populations were vulnerable. Connected populations thrived. And Canada, whether by accident or design, had created one of the most genetically connected populations on Earth. So what does this all mean? The Canadian DNA study did not discover a new species or rewrite evolution. It simply documented what happens when you take the mess of human migration, the reality of colonization, the waves of immigration, and the quiet persistence of people forming families across every imaginable boundary, and you let it run for a few generations. What you get is complexity. Beautiful, irreducible complexity. A population that defies easy categorization. A country where the average person carries genetic echoes from 3 or more continents, where indigenous ancestry shows up in people who never knew it was there, where Asian, European, African, and Middle Eastern genes sit side by side in the same genome. This does not make Canadians special. It makes them normal, because this has always been the human story. We move, we mix, we adapt. The borders and categories we invented are real in the social sense. They shape lives, determine opportunities, and create identities. But genetically, they are permeable, always have been. Dr. Chen's study will not end debates about immigration or identity. It will not resolve political fights or heal historical wounds. But it does offer a reminder that underneath the labels we use, we are all part of one long, tangled, beautiful story of survival. And the mixing happening in Canada right now, it is not new. It is what humans have always done. The only difference is that now, for the first time, we have the tools to see it written in our DNA. If this kind of deep dive into what genetics reveals about us fascinates you, subscribe now. Next week, I am breaking down the latest research on Neanderthal DNA and why some populations have more of it than others. The findings challenge everything you thought you knew about human evolution. The video on screen right now explores how scientists trace the origins of blue eyes to a single person who lived 6,000 years ago. Click it. You will not regret it.